But I'm really happy to have René you here, making all the way over the Baltic Sea. And René is really one of the world-leading experts on strategic foresight. He's done incredible amount of good quality studies on how to understand and measure and develop the future preparedness of companies. How to create this kind of a model, framework, a tool to understand where do this organization lies in terms of how they are using futures in their own activities, be they strategic or operational. And he's been doing extensively on articles and books about that. So it's really a pleasure for us to have you here, René. And so I just applaud you to the floor right now.
Thanks very much, Marco. Thanks very much, Marco. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you see, I've been choosing a bit of a provocative title here, talking about midterm, and then you see this little corporate dev. So it's not ours, but we increasingly see a problem with having sustainable firms. And in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll try to convince you that this is actually a problem we should all care for. I'd like to start my little story here with my own background. I've been working, well, it is certainly working like this, and eventually it will connect, yes. I've been starting much of my foresight work working for this company here. We're talking here about the Deutsche Telekom, which is formerly a state-owned company, one which has, when it started to exist as a private company, inherited a great business model. All the network is dug into the ground and you need only to charge people now to use it. No risk-taking. It allows you to have a lot of profit and have this feeling of you're going to conquer the world, as shown on this little map here. However, it's also a business model with an expiry date. So you know this is eventually going to end. And in fact, when I was working there, we were losing 5 to 10% of annual revenue every year. So that's typically something where you would feel, well, that's terrible. I'm starting to feel the end of my lifetime, which in many ways you don't. So as an employee, you know, you still have your income, you might even have a nice corporate car, you might have bonuses from time to time. So you're working in a company, and that is true for a lot of levels in that firm, and you're not even seeing that your life is sort of coming to an end. And that, of course, is a problem if you care for the survival of your firm. When you look at this type of data, survival of the largest firms we have around, which is here in this case the S&P 500 companies, we see that the average life expectancy is decreasing dramatically. When we think about ourselves and how long we might live, then it goes the opposite direction. There's a number of reasons for that. So we know that there's a lot of investment in medicine, in having a healthier life, in making sure that we have the right health and safety precautions in our organizations for humans to survive. But why can't we take sufficient precautions to survive as firms? And my students in the classroom, they often say, well, is that actually at all a problem? Are we not anyway talking about the large and arrogant and so on firms? You know, why don't we all take the place which they vacant when they die with smaller firms? And one can take that point of view to a certain extent. So it is a renewal process in industry which happens like this. But the unfortunate thing is, if you try to get sustainable and responsible behavior out of firms which expect to live only for 20 years, it will be way, way harder than from a firm which is expecting to live for 200 years. That is why fundamentally also, if we want to have sustainable societies and populations of firms, that we need to care for survival of large firms also, even if we don't like them all the time. Now, one thing which I want to point out here, and I did already in the title, is the lack of tangibility in this. I don't know who from you is owning such a device. I started to have one, not wearing it, because one of the features is that it tells you every hour to stand up, which is rather inconvenient in a conference, or you might look a bit like a fool. It tells you to stand up because it's good for your health, and it's important to not sit the entire day behind your desk. The tangibility is almost maximal, right? I mean, you get even this little buzzer. I'm always waiting for the electroshock to happen. Then that is probably maximum tangibility, but it tells you how to behave, and it shapes behavior. What is shaping behavior of our management in firms? Is it these types of graphs? Well, I have to say, working for different large organizations, both inside and maybe as a consultant, yes, that is shaping behavior. What is on these type of charts? Well, it is the current and past revenue figures. It's profitability, broken down by regions, product segments, so it's getting more and more difficult to read, and it grabs more and more of the attention. Don't know how many read the nice article in the 90s from Gary Hamel and C.K. Prahlad, which they calculate that, with a bit of a weird formula, but they calculate that it's only 3% of the attention of top management which is dedicated to creating a future outlook. And they better be efficient, right? So if that's true, then here's part of the explanation. What is very tangible, what's grabbing your attention, is these types of numbers. So for me, that is clearly not good enough. When we think about who has informed us in the past about what firms should be doing, then I actually like to go back for a number of reasons to the French school, even though there's clearly the school which is represented here also in Finland. But Gaston Berger was a public servant at a time where we just survived a war, where all of us would have been fighting potentially against each other. Wars where we had actually a succession of wars every 30 years, utter depression. How are we going to live in a world like this? How can we change dramatically the way we work as a society? And of course the imminent threat of a terminal nuclear war, which might then be at least taking away all the misery of surviving a future, because then there wouldn't be a future. And at that moment in time, he says, well, one observation I have is that we can debate forever, and we have also the right methods to talk about the means, but not the ends. We're not talking, and we're not jointly creating this future we want to live in. And apart from that, he has been very successful to building this club of La Prospective, which most of the CAC 40 companies, the biggest companies in France, were members, were adopting methods which we would call futures methods these days, or strategic thinking methods. And that inspired also my research. When I started to go out, I started to go to companies which I got pointed towards with the expectation that they are good at creating future perspectives, good at creating new markets, revolutionizing their industry and some niches at least, some more than others. But essentially what I found in 2010 is that if there are futures practices, then they are mostly patchy. So you do some scenarios, you might do a roadmap from time to time. If you're good, you might even do some backcasting back from scenarios, but it often was not part of the productive, so to speak, strategy planning or innovation management. It was something which was more marginal, and that's of course a huge problem. So none of the firms I visited had this constant stream of business renewal activities. And these days, when you go back mentally to us as humans, as individuals who need to not only survive but also keep a job, for instance, in the world which is ever changing, and we talked already here about Industry 4.0 and how that will change the way we work. how the way we work will change dramatically in the future, etc., then you realize that that cannot be good enough for survival, let alone superior profitability. So we started to investigate further, and this is sort of the latest version of what we call our maturity model of corporate foresight. Some might recognize some of the inner practices here as part of our original model. We have now started to look into what are actually the check marks you need to go through in being able to perceive faster and earlier than your competitors, to understand deeper the change drivers and how, particularly in a systemic way, they create new markets, where the tipping points are, etc. And what we also recently added is the word probing up here. Because one needs to realize, if you're in a large organization and you're pitching new ideas, then it's not good enough to do that with a PowerPoint presentation. You need to have proof of concept. You need to show something on the ground. You need to parade customers, etc., etc. So what we now call our 3 Ps here of corporate foresight, perceiving, prospecting, and probing, is something where firms will differ fundamentally in how good they are. In perceiving, you need to make sure that you have sensors exactly where you typically didn't have sensors in the past. So what created your success in the past is certainly not what's going to create your success in the future, so you better look somewhere else. You need to analyze broad and deep, which is very difficult to do when you're just dealing with one strategic issue after another. So that's something you need to do on an ongoing basis. Many firms simply don't. They would spend a lot of money when they have one concrete question. They hire a team of McKinsey consultants, 6 who sit around on your laps, and another 20 in the back office, and they don't mind spending this to get this one answer. But they actually need to twist that logic and say, we need to scan for ourselves on a continuous basis. As I move down the list, typically my corporate audiences, they start shifting more and more on their chairs. So one question, do you challenge dominant beliefs? Is something where they say, yeah, from time to time, I'm thinking about how I run my business and reflecting, etc. But is it systematic? No, it's not systematic. And the problem with many don't perceive is that all the other forces, they function a bit like gravity. They always pull back the firm to behave in a very similar manner like all the other firms in that same industry. So what we mentally need to take here as a leap is to say, well, we might be, and to use the term of somebody else, a red ocean where I'm in an industry behaving like most of the other firms in that industry and following the same mental models how this industry work. We need to take that leap of faith and say we're going to jump to that blue ocean. Picture which comes to my mind, maybe because I'm seeing too often that video, is this little Nemo fish, who says, okay, I'm here, there's soon no oxygen in my fish tank, I need to get out, but yeah, I don't want to, it's kind of risky and so on. But is death where you stay, if you stay. So we need to prepare firms for this leap of faith, and that is of course very, very difficult already for us as individuals, jumping from one job to a completely different one, and for firms it becomes even more difficult because they need to discuss with all the internal stakeholders. It might be not the mandate just with the one executive board. You might have a supervisory board. You might have representatives of employees, etc., etc. But here, systems thinking, of course, helps. Using scenarios helps because you can focus discussion around the ends and not the means. And then eventually you need typically a lot of trial and error learning here. And the most difficult thing typically for my corporate audience to grasp is, what is an appetite for uncertainty and why should I have it? Isn't it good enough that I care for the numbers and that I chase people for business cases and for NPV numbers? And our answer, of course, jointly would be no, it's of course not good enough. Why? Because you don't have the data on the future, let alone clear understanding what you're chasing for. So you need to create this appetite for uncertainty, and of course very justified to have that appetite because that's also where the profit lies, right? So this is something which from the framework you see, from our empirical evidence we see, and then we often get asked, yeah, but what comes out of it? And here we now start to have the need to look in a longitudinal fashion in what's going on. Here's one of the cases which we looked into, where General Electric was performing a large foresight exercise, and among other trends they stumble upon the water scarcity. For GE at that time that's a bit of a no-brainer, because they say we're not in the water business, so move on. They said, yeah, maybe not so fast, let's think about that, because many of our customers in the Middle East, in Asia and so on, they face water scarcity and they are good energy business customers. So what they realize is that there could be something very interesting for the customers. For instance, energy self-sustaining desalination plants. That is something which they not only realized, but they then started, of course, to look deeper into it. And then doing also the typical activities of thinking, okay, when would firms be able to buy that? When does it make financial sense for them? What kind of target costs do we need to have, etc., etc. Why I think that this probing is so important is because you eventually need to show the proof of concept. And if you want to have customers, you need to have somewhere to parade them through and convince them that it's actually working. For them, they're organized in 3 major R&D centers, which have a lot of own money to spend strategically on these kind of demonstrators. And they built also a pilot plant which showed the proof of concept and was used then heavily by the key accounts to bring the customers in. What happens afterwards is something which most firms typically good at: accelerating, finding the right takeover targets. In this case, it's 2 main takeovers they did, both north of 1 billion in investments, so major investments. But that is after the difficult part of working out why this is a viable business and why it's interesting to make that leap into this uncharted territory. What kind of reward is at the end is that higher uncertainty should also yield higher profitability. And in this case, we're talking about a new business unit which was formed for energy and water, which was around 18% of the revenues at that time when it was launched, and that was 2013. And at that time, they were doing 31% of profits from the entire GE portfolio. So they were much more profitable than most other business units. And that's something which you ultimately need to fight for as a firm again and again, to jump from this pool of the red ocean to the blue ocean where life is much nicer. What I also want to point out with this other case is that you need to be persistent about it. And I had captured a very interesting discussion around, well, can we as democracies actually stay persistent if we change our governments all the time? I'm not going to comment on this. But as an organization, I've been working for organizations who have reorganized every year or so and changed CEO every 3 years or so. Staying persistent means that it needs to survive people, which is never easy. And when we look, of course, at countries and then also companies in that countries who have often even some planned economy background, where they have an appetite for these long-term plans, like Korea and Samsung, then we see how they really develop markets over 20 years' time. They take that view that I want to be number one in this place, and I'm not going to be that with the next generation technology and not even the second generation technology. I'm going to go for the 3rd generation of technology. And meanwhile, I'm going to learn a lot by being a white label manufacturer. And what we, however, see is that already quite early they were able, when they entered the smartphone market, to create even a new category. What you see there is what's also called a phablet, so a big smartphone with a pen. That's actually something where they have been truly the innovator. So this type of longitudinal research shows us the causality. Now, what we of course wonder is there an indicator which might make you feel bad directly when you're not doing enough? And the type of mindset I'm having here is maybe represented by this. I don't know if any one of you has tried to buy a device which is then not A++ in energy efficiency. I tried it once, so it was a really nice refrigerator, and I was there with my wife, and it was an A+. So I thought, yeah, that's fair enough, price is good, and so on. But the look I got was a bit like I was going to suggest that we're going to enroll our kids in Trump University or so. So my wife was really not happy. So this is the way indicators work. So you need to tell people that it's really not good what you're doing. So you might imagine how it worked after that. My wife put the foot down, and don't have to say that much these days anymore. And we bought the other also nice refrigerator. So the idea here is, can we do the same with what I now call future preparedness? So we talked about the maturity in corporate foresight as one of the axes, but the interesting thing you uncover see with firms often is that they say, yeah, but for us, we're in such a stable business, we might not have the same need. Sometimes that discussion also ends quickly because you say, well, actually you used to be in a stable business, but when you look outside the window to these startups, they were going to disrupt you quite fast. But there is also stable businesses. So the idea is here that if we have an indicator, then it needs to be also robust to that. Then we need to be able to say, okay, you can stay calm, you're also vigilant, because you're actually living in a stable environment. How do we construct something like this? And for me, even though I would not present it if I don't feel that is actually mature enough to present it to this audience, I think we can still learn together how to apply this. But we have a model which gives us the maturity of their corporate foresight activities. We then want to get the need, which we start with the obvious criteria like the dynamism or volatility of the environment, the complexity, the hostility. All of them would drive the need for foresight. And we add actually another category here, which we call the strategic orientation. And that is important because there's, of course, firms who would also choose to simply follow others. And then they might also get away with a lower level of maturity. Now, all four are driving that level. It's not this is level 1, this is level 2. So that's not how to read the chart. All these factors, they are driving these levels. And then we do a very simple thing. We compare the two levels. Right? And if you're on the same level, say 2 on the need level and 2 on the maturity, then you are a vigilant company and you're green. So be happy, enjoy it, and make something out of it. And then there's all kinds of deficiencies. I would like to point out one, which is maybe not such an obvious one. We have seen also in our case studies firms which we would call neurotic. That is firms which are actually doing too much foresight. There's other scholars who call that hyperopia. That is the ones who don't take the time to manage the firms today in today's markets. So they're always in the scenario world. There's a very interesting case study from George Bird and colleague who looked into this. So that is also a theoretical thing which we just wanted to test for. And that would be, of course, having a higher level here than what you actually need. Now, what do we find? And essentially, I already pointed out, we can't look at the future preparedness today and at the performance today. Right? So you expect that your future preparedness investment is paying off in the midterm. So what we're expecting to find here is when we combine these two elements to a future preparedness score, that we would have a predictor for the firm's ability to find a superior position in markets of the future. So my little fish who jumps from the red ocean to the blue ocean. That's what we're expecting. That can be shown in a binary fashion, so saying, oh yeah, here's a firm which has been going into new spaces all the time. Of course, Apple comes to mind, where they would disrupt one industry after another, the music industry, the telecommunication industry, the media industry, maybe the health industry in the future, who knows. That is sort of what we're trying to see here as a phenomenon. And then eventually, of course, we're expecting that this is also paying off in superior profitability and growth. And in this case, we take here market valuation growth. That's of course the moment where you start wondering if I need to catch my plane now, if I do have data to tell you something about this. Well, the good thing is that we have some data. I'm saying some data because we're talking in a minute about 40 cases which we have tracked over time. So we're using also here descriptive statistics and not theory testing statistical models. But here's a first way of showing what's going on. This is what I call a migration analysis. So what you see represented by these little dots here is the individual firms. And we classify them based on their position in the industry into the groups outperformers, average and underperformers. One thing which might already be a bit odd, but seeing it for the first time, is why are they actually not all in the outperform group? And there's a lot of reasons for that, that in the moment where we're checking for the future preparedness and for the profitability, there's a lot of disincentive to engage in foresight. Because when you're operating just your current business and expanding abroad, for instance, then you're not focusing on where is my new business, which kind of market or industry should I enter. And that we see again and again, even to the point where I was working for a large conglomerate where one of the business unit was the business unit within the conglomerate, everyone looking as role model. And they get the attribute in danger here, so the worst kind of deficiency you can have. So everyone looks at me and say, okay, that's the moment where he takes his plane and is off. Until that firm said, yeah, it's true. I mean, we are just scaling our business model right now. We're not inventing here anything. Then everyone was really surprised. But that is what you often get when you have also too much success. When we look at 2015, we see some movement. So some of these vigilant firms, they're actually able to enhance their competitive position. So there's a number of firms who we now can also look into the history and validate that they really have taken also major strategic leaps to improve their position. So it's quite amazing, firms which are underperformer, everyone is selling the stocks off, they increase their position. Out of the ones who changed their position, there's only one who decreased their position. And for that, there's even an interesting story where they're actually the third company in a group which is dominated by two companies and a lot of small ones. And in that industry, they took quite a big bet, which you kind of applaud as a futurist and say, wonderful. Well, sometimes you can also be then hit by things you have no control over. In this case, they invested heavily in some sports events which didn't turn out as they thought, at least not for the teams they supported. Now, when we look at the ones with deficiencies, similar pattern. So we see that the prediction in most cases holds true. They're moving down and others are moving up, but only 2 out of the 5. So that's already kind of encouraging. What we did next is then to look at the financial numbers. That's what we're going to see here. When we look at what kind of group they were in, were they vigilant or neurotic or vulnerable or in danger in 2008, and what kind of profitability do they have in 2015, we get this type of numbers. What that shows is that in our sample we have an average profitability of 12%, and the vigilant firms are on average significantly better, in this case 33% higher. And you see that if you say, well, for me vulnerable might be okay, then you see that you're taking on average quite a high discount. It gets even bleaker, that picture, when we look at your growth prospects. So what we see here is that on average the firms have a market valuation growth of 25%, while the vigilant have of 75%. So that's basically tripling the average. And again, you see that if you have deficiencies, it's not good news on average for you. So what that means is that enhancing future preparedness seems to pay off in our sample. Now I'm saying our sample here because we're continuously collecting more data, and then we need to wait 8 years to process the data again. But then we can actually have also rolling averages of these effects. So in the future we will have more robust findings. But these are already very encouraging, very significant in what we're trying to see here. And what we'll do in the future also more is track the life of individual companies. With that, I'm closing already my talk with a picture of researchers who got involved here to say it's not just me doing all these things. And as a kind of open call to say, you know, join us. We're always very open to share also our models. We have online questionnaires which you can use also for collecting your own data from your own companies. So feel free to reach out to us. Thanks very much, and now looking forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you, René. This kind of mind-blowing talk. What I would like to emphasize is that the good news that it pays off. Okay, now we have to spread this information to all businesses in the world, and we will all have a very good future in regarding our projects. What I specifically like in your approach is the kind of combination of empirical studies, good theoretical background, and then having these measure sticks that kind of are difficult to argue against. And I think we have about 15 minutes time, and I would have questions for 2 hours. But, well, actually my first question would be, this is rather modest, but you got, for the longer period data, you had 40 companies, and previously in a book you report about 70 companies. How on earth did you get them to answer to your questions?
Yeah, that's also a persistence lecture. So, yes, we basically chased them for a long time. There's also some other tricks we pull off to say, okay, it's not just about answering this and reading my book or my report. It's also about having a benchmarking workshop afterwards, which also triggered a lot of interest then. So it's really about, you know, playing also a little bit the consultant card of saying we're going to do something for you. And what we're working on right now is to convert our online questionnaire, which is a dumb thing. You hit the send button and then we say thank you very much, and then they hear or don't hear from us. We convert that into an instant feedback type of questionnaire. So we're quite excited about that, and we're happy to spread the word when, you know, we have that, so that they actually get also some direct feedback, which for many would be also a good catalyst for internally in their organization to say, look, I mean, we're scoring not good, we better do something, and I'll be happy to do it, provided the budget.
You have a problem, and they have a problem, and you are the solution. Okay, do you have some kind of challenges in combining the consultancy card, as you said, and then being a university professor, or is this kind of normal procedure in Denmark?
Well, funnily enough, I think it becomes more and more a necessity, because as a university professor, you're increasingly asked to do impossible things in 24 hours. So you already asked me whether I sleep at all when I send you emails at 2 o'clock. I think you simply need to seek synergies all the time, and I think we do that in a good way without trampling on anyone's feet. So we do have projects with firms. They supply empirical data, also give deep access for our process research, for instance, where we chase them through many interviews and look at data and so on. And they would simply not do that if I would have just the academic hat on.
Okay. Good. Now a bit more technical, methodological question. You had the 2 phases in the maturity framework. the need and the preparedness, and somehow I have this feeling that you didn't say it, but are you looking at the needs of the how the environment is evolving with scenarios, or do you have other tools in your toolbox?
Yeah, we're basically creating an index here. So these three categories jointly have, I think, 20 sub-indicators. How volatile is your political environment? Have you had more than 3 surprises in the last 5 years? And these kind of questions, where they then get scored. And with that score, we create an index. It depends also on how we then do our research, because we have basically the way of just collecting it through surveys, which we typically administer on the phone. So we send the questionnaire up front, but when we discuss on the phone, we actually fill it in together, because often you can't really trust that everyone understands every question and so on. And then, of course, we use the same model when we're in workshops with top management. And then it becomes often very interesting, because you have them score these these indicators here before the workshop, and then you realize that they don't even agree in the top management team. And then you have first an informed discussion about, how volatile is our industry really. And then you typically conclude on a level on the left-hand side and right-hand side, and that becomes then sort of owner-driven engagement then, because they say, okay, we do realize we have a mismatch here.
Having disagreements, I think, is a very good way to promote futures thinking and discussion about the future and get people kind of alerted to a new level. I agree. And this is a theoretical question then. I think you might be familiar with the concept of foresightfulness. How would you relate that to the foresight maturity concept?
So foresightfulness is more ingrained in the individual actor and what the actor does. It's also related to sort of activities you do on a leadership space and so on. For us, I have to admit that we developed that in parallel, being actually ignorant towards the other one. So I think we could actually and that is some long years back, so I'm quite aware of it now. But we probably can profit more from each other, because it is certainly something which we get informed every day, and you see here probably the 6th or 7th iteration of our model, which is informed by what we need to observe and what is also observable, where do we feel we get actually valid information from our respondents, and what can they judge and can they not judge. And foresightfulness, my little critique on that would be that you need to be almost a trained foresighter to really answer to it properly, while we're trying to have a tool which is answerable by any manager without any pre-knowledge.
Well, this actually I can catch up from being a trained foresight professional. There are actually not very many trained foresight professionals in the whole world, so that they would have a kind of a master's degree and doctoral degree on the same subject. But it's kind of, usually we have some kind of other backgrounds, and then we come to the futures research domain to share ideas and with our own backgrounds. What is your story, where you kind of come from?
So my personal story was that I was recruited by Deutsche Telekom to run technology foresight. And at that time they said, yeah, you can combine it with a doctorate at the Technical University of Berlin, and that sounded medium attractive for me. And then my wife said, hey, but Berlin, that's actually very good, because I was going to move somewhere else. So I started to join Deutsche Telekom, and in fact that has been very good, because they've been also on this long tradition of technology foresight, but neglecting a lot the market side. And then we build up way more knowledge about how to make then change, also mental change, happen in what the business model is going to be about, etc. And that is then also my story, why I like to now talk about it very holistically.
Okay, yeah, Berlin is a nice city, and it's always good to listen to the wife.
I know that.
What was that? I still have something. This may be interesting. Many of studies what we have discussed here on these 2 days have focused on rather public organizations than business organizations. What would be your message, or how could this be used for those organizations?
It's probably three messages. I mean, one is that what I'm shown here as a route was Gaston Berger and La Prospective in France, and that was energized and then also mentally sort of prepared as a set of approaches to make sure that we're steering towards a future of desire and not future of fate where it's going to lead me. So that the techniques, the tools and so on is something we share. I think in public organizations, the way I get exposed to them, you often have even more rigidity through rules which are set in place, budgeting processes and so on. So often you need even a bit more powerful methods to say, we're going to create joint scenarios to understand what our city would look like in 10 years' time, or in even better 40 years' time. So we have a lot of discussion today, how do we get all the cars out of the city, how do we reclaim streets for actually living spaces or not dead concrete spaces, etc., etc. But all of those would require a lot of changes along the way. So you need in public organizations, I think, even more of the medicine I'm proposing here. And I think that the third message is really that we actually eventually will see that the way we run for-profit organizations and non-profit organizations will become closer and closer, because also the for-profit organizations are moving to a more holistic understanding of their purpose and giving back something to society, etc. So that will blend anyway, I think.
Okay. Good. Final question. Always have to have something critical. What do you regard as a problem in this? You have given this much thought. What would be the aspect that should kind of cause our attention if we're trying to apply it for specific cases? What could be the way to develop it further?
So I think as always in research, there's a lot of ways to develop that further. I think, of course, any time you take a model out, it has some deficiencies to reality or some differences to reality. So I think what we as a research community around this program we run think is essential is that we get closer to the firms, go into longitudinal research, talk more with managers how things happened. So we also engaging in research where we trace over 20 years the lifetime of a company. I think that's where we need to develop further, and also go sort of further into understanding what is really the deficiencies of the actual practice execution. Because there's a lot of lip service of saying, oh, we're working with scenarios, we do this fantastic backcasting, and when you start taking some sheets off that big phrase, then there's not much to uncover.
Okay, that's enough for my part. Thank you, René Rohrbeck. It's splendid to have you here.